Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and our speaker for this afternoon is Terry Schwartz. Terry is the Director of Kent State University's Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative, and her work at the CUDC includes neighborhood and campus planning, commercial and residential design guidelines, and ecological strategies for vacant land reuse. And this session is titled Climate Migration Scenarios for the Great Lakes Region. And this lecture explores future design and development scenarios for the Great Lakes cities, as well as the risks of climate gentrification, the needs of existing and historically underserved communities, and the ecological imperative to protect the health of the Great Lakes Basin. I do ask you to please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Terry Schwartz.
Thanks, John. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I've never been to Lakeside before. We were just talking a few minutes ago that even though we're really quite close to Cleveland, once you kind of go under that gateway, it really is a different world. So this is just a delightful way to spend a summer day. As John said, my organization's part of Kent State University. We're part of the College of Architecture and Environmental Design, but we're a little part of the college that's sprung loose from the main campus in Kent, and we're based in downtown Cleveland. So our center does two things. We train graduate students in architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture. And we also have a nonprofit community design and research practice. So through our practice, we engage with communities around the region on a variety of things, streetscape design, neighborhood plans. We do a lot of work, as John mentioned, with vacant land reuse. The closest project to where we are today goes back maybe 6 or 7 years, where we did a downtown strategy for Put-in-Bay. I did that project with a group of our graduate students, which was a lot of fun. We were there late in the season, so past the party time at Put-in-Bay. Basically we were created to be able to assist communities with planning and urban design services. We work a lot in communities that don't have, kind of easy access to architects and designers. We're really created to fill a gap in practice in order to be useful wherever we can be. So the kind of work we do really is very broad. We work in core cities. We do a ton of work in Cleveland, because of course that's where we're based. We work in suburban locations and townships. We're very interested in civic architecture, and we run a youth program for middle school and high school kids called Making Our Own Space, which is active this afternoon in Cleveland. They don't need me, it's fine. The students, the participants envision improvements to their neighborhoods and then construct them at full scale as temporary installations so that they can test different ideas for improving the comfort and livability of their communities. So that's just a quick overview of what we do. But today I wanted to talk specifically about this topic around climate change and climate migration. I've lived in Cleveland since the 1990s, and as long as I've been in Cleveland, people have always said, yes, the city of Cleveland has lost many people since its peak population in the late 1950s. But as, as the coasts start to get, inundated with sea level rise, as wildfires and heat waves and such make other parts of the country more difficult to live in, well, they'll all be back. And so we kind of wanted to explore this question of what does that actually mean? There are clearly some strategic advantages to the older industrial cities of the Great Lakes. Central location, ample fresh water being top of the list there. But what would it actually take for this kind of large scale population movement to actually happen? And how would it play out? Because when we say they'll be back, like who are these they? Would it be kind of people, businesses, and people coming with resources to reinvest in the cities of the Great Lakes? Would it be refugees coming in situations of terrible distress? Are people going to come all at once? Or is it a gradual trickle? All of these things, and I'm a city planner by training, really affect the way that we prepare for whatever is going to happen next. The challenge being is that we don't know what's going to happen next. So this is population change. This map is showing just between 2010 and 2020. But this pattern has been underway for a much longer period of time. As I'm sure you know, that in the coastal areas, in the Sun Belt, population has been growing for decades. And in cities like Detroit and Cleveland and Buffalo and others, population has been declining. And in Cleveland, the peak population was nearly 1 million people, and now we're well under 400,000. So there's lots of implications of that, of how you manage a city that's experienced that level of loss and disinvestment. But so we embarked on this work to really think about like what it would mean if, kind of people came back, like where would they go? How would we prepare for that kind of change? This work has been done by the University of Pennsylvania, the McHarg Center, part of an Atlas for a Green New Deal that looks at environmental hazards across the country. And you can see there in that sort of north coast part of Ohio, there's really no tone on the map, a little bit of flooding. But other parts of the country are at higher risk for hurricanes, for floods, for wildfires and earthquakes. Relatively speaking, the kind of Great Lakes Basin and the communities within it are at less risk, as far as we can tell, from some of the more extreme impacts of climate change. So there is this thinking, right, that kind of there are going to be winners and losers as a result of climate change and climate migration. But what I guess I would suggest to you is that if our region around the Great Lakes, if the revitalization of the region is really dependent on utter devastation in other parts of the country, that probably if we're calling winners and losers, then we're doing the math wrong. I think that we need to kind of take a look at land use patterns across the country and really think about the ways to protect people, resources, and ecosystems throughout the country, rather than playing this kind of zero-sum game of winners and losers. Because honestly, if things get as bad as they could, kind of there really aren't going to be any winners in this situation. That said, there are communities that are already actively marketing themselves as climate havens and climate destinations. I think this marketing campaign was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but kind of the city of Duluth, Minnesota has already kind of talked about as climate change begins to kind of take hold across the country and across the globe, that maybe Duluth will be a destination for climate migrants. That said, if you've ever been to Duluth in the winter, it's not there yet. Although it may not get as hot in the summers, it still gets bitterly cold. And so people who are currently, kind of thinking about, all I'm going to suggest here is that this word climate proof is, if you ever see that, you should raise an eyebrow, because there is no such thing as a climate haven. There is no such thing as a climate proof city, because the reality is that climate change means the climate is changing. I know that sounds obvious, but even in the more stable parts of the US, even the more kind of climate haven-like regions of the US, we're experiencing climate change here too, in terms of flooding, in terms of increased high heat. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what is ultimately going to happen. So for any community in this moment to stake its claim on being, kind of safe from climate change is, I think, unrealistic and overly optimistic. Because this is GLISA, this is the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments. That's what that acronym stands for. It's at the University of Michigan, and it's beginning to, kind of monitor both historic patterns of temperature and hydrology, and also projecting into the future. So what this is showing is that between 2041 and 2070, that, kind of parts of the Great Lakes are also going to be getting significantly higher if current trends prevail. So pretending that, somehow we're safe from the impacts of climate change is, I think, really not the best approach to explore. This is for Cleveland, and it's basically showing that our temperatures are climbing faster than a lot of other places in the country. It's still fairly temperate, especially compared to Phoenix, where my family lives, but we are seeing, kind of climate temperature increases just like elsewhere in the country and the world. We're also experiencing, and likely to continue to experience, significantly more precipitation, rain and snow, and more volatility in weather. So before we start inviting the world to our shores because we're safe from climate change, we really need to wrestle with the ways that climate change are going to impact our region. So this is a pretty startling table. I'm sorry, it's a beautiful summer day. I don't mean to get into boring tables, but the idea is that, kind of between the 1950s and the early 2020s, that the amount of precipitation falling in Cleveland has, kind of increased by more than 50%. So we really are starting to see some of these impacts, particularly in flooding. These two cities obviously aren't Great Lakes cities, but they are cities on rivers, and this was just last summer. The point is that anywhere it rains, it can flood, anywhere. Older industrial cities have older infrastructure, and any cities on a river, like Cleveland, can experience this level of catastrophic flooding, and we really do need to prepare for, kind of the uncertainties ahead. Another issue is that if we're staking our future on the health of the Great Lakes, we should do, obviously, a better job of taking care of the health of the Great Lakes. Kind of the algae blooms that we've seen in Lake Erie in recent years really pose a threat to the fresh water supply that will drive the economy of the region and also, help people. Obviously we all depend on water, and so we have to, kind of do a better job of reducing the discharges into the Great Lakes, especially into Lake Erie, which is the most shallow and vulnerable of the Great Lakes Basin. Okay, so when we think about scenarios, where I started here is what does that future look like? If we just say people are going to come back to the Great Lakes, I think that that's too simplistic, and we need to be maybe a little more nuanced in the way that we understand what might happen. So some of the work that we do, kind of involves scenario planning, which essentially doesn't say what will happen or what should happen, but possibly exploring what could happen, recognizing that any of the future scenarios are going to have some positive impacts and some negative ones, and so there's not one ideal future, but different kinds of options that may happen. So what this table is simply showing is that on the vertical axis, it's population growth versus population decline. For anybody who's worked in Cleveland or Detroit for years, know that all cities kind of plan for growth, but sometimes population goes in the other direction. So I don't think that we can count on population growth, and I also don't think we should resign ourselves to continued population decline, but recognize that either of those options could happen. On the horizontal axis, it's, kind of, will the Great Lakes cities be severely impacted by climate change, or will those climate impacts be more moderate? So in the upper right corner, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but if we have population growth and also severe climate impacts, all that means is that perhaps other parts of the country are experiencing something worse. But if thousands of people started to come into Cleveland as we were seeing more extreme climate challenges, that could potentially be really difficult to manage an inflow of new residents at the same time, kind of as we're struggling with larger and larger challenges. However, new residents bring new tax dollars and employment, et cetera, so we might have more resources to help manage the severe impacts of climate change if population were also growing. The upper left-hand corner, I'm going to just touch on that one because that's, I think, for a lot of people, sort of this dream scenario that, kind of climate change in Cleveland and other Great Lakes cities will be pretty mild, and we'll start to see population growth and an increase in the tax base, et cetera. But I think, kind of as we watched what happened during the pandemic, I think it's important to recognize that if people start rediscovering the older cities of the Great Lakes region, that risks come along with that. Suddenly more people coming into the community, kind of particularly people arriving with resources, really kind of puts people at risk who are always at risk, which are lower income households, people of color, who may suddenly find themselves pushed out of their homes because, kind of their regions become less affordable. And we're seeing sort of things like this play out, even in cities like Phoenix, where there were a lot of people moving from California into Phoenix, really driving up housing prices. Large areas of the Pacific Northwest have become really unaffordable for the people who live there. So again, there's some positive things that could happen if we have a fairly stable climate and an influx of new residents and businesses. But we also have to manage the risks and also take especially good care to protect the people who are already living in these places. The bottom sides are a little more depressing. This is if population declines and we have severe climate impacts. We may not have the resources to do the things we need. That might be the scenario where, kind of the Great Lakes Compact collapses and water from the Great Lakes Basin begins moving to some of the more dry, desert-prone parts of the country. I have heard that scenario. It would be terrible, obviously, for the ecosystems of the Great Lakes. But that possibility that as we continue to lose population in the Great Lakes region, we lose political power, and suddenly the Great Lakes are compromised so that the water can be used where there are more people. And then the bottom corner is kind of a little bit like what we have right now, which is a fairly slow but steady ongoing population decline while we're managing the challenges of, kind of moderate impacts of climate change. I won't go into these, but this really suggests the different ways that if we did see an influx of people into this, these are of Cleveland, people could either, kind of, we could focus that development within the existing cities, Cleveland and Akron and Sandusky, et cetera, taking advantage of the vacancy and the land banking that these cities and counties have been doing for decades as a way of repopulating, rebuilding, and reusing the existing infrastructure. That scenario, that upper right scenario, is most likely if population migration, if climate migration happens slowly. If there's a surge of people, kind of moving to the Great Lakes, then it's a different kind of thing entirely. It's very hard to do infill development when you're experiencing mass migration. So at that point, either, kind of sprawling development at the peripheries of the urban regions, or, kind of possibly, kind of, really high efficiency climate, carbon neutral development happening in, kind of dense clusters connected by transit. I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can envision this future. Again, it's just hard when you don't really know which of these scenarios are ultimately going to play out. When we work with municipalities, what we do is try to, kind of talk with people about how you watch for signs and signals in the noise, right? And so, like, if you see an increase in building permit activity, if you see a surge in housing prices that's more than just localized pockets but across the region, those are ways to sort of see whether, kind of migration is actually underway. Because people are always moving in and out of cities, but what's the difference between a coincidence and a trend and a, kind of a wave of population growth? So this just suggests, I mean, maybe a little bit not that serious because Masdar in the UAE is a pretty unique place, built to be a carbon neutral city. But like as a city planner, my inclination is if people are moving back into our urban regions to resettle, repopulate, and reuse the existing communities that we already have, which is one option. But this one talks about, well, no, maybe we would just build new cities to really be able to accommodate massive growth, and that those cities would be designed to, kind of be totally circular, not creating waste, and not, using unnecessary energy or too much water. This is one that we made for Cleveland along Opportunity Corridor, if you know Cleveland, but this is not actually what's being built along Opportunity Corridor. It was like our thought about how businesses could begin to repopulate and take advantage of our existing rail infrastructure. This is a part of the city that's experienced massive depopulation and disinvestment, but still retains some of the best and most intense transit infrastructure. So why wouldn't this be the job center for the region by infilling the vacant spaces that were once industrial with new clean industries and job opportunities that residents could actually get to? Infill at the residential scale can look like this, you know, for every vacant lot, suddenly a new house is rising. But again, this is the kind of scenario that would only work if the, you know, kind of population growth is happening in a gradual and manageable fashion. Okay, so what keeps people from, you know, kind of making choices about moving into the Great Lakes? I mean, this summer maybe is a little less dramatic than last summer when the air quality was so terrible that it felt like the sky was on fire most days. Last summer, there were climate catastrophes all around the country and all around the world. And if anything was going to spur people to move, you would have thought, I would have thought, that we would start to see more of that, you know, kind of population dynamic in play. But there are things that, you know, kind of keep people where they are. So at the left is Phoenix, as I said, where my family lives. It remains one of the fastest growing cities in the country, despite the fact that sometimes it's so hot in Phoenix that the airplanes can't even take off because they can't function in the heat. But if you imagine yourself as a developer in downtown Phoenix, you've got cranes in the air and this building kind of coming out of the ground, multiple buildings coming out of the ground. You're not going to wake up at breakfast one morning and think, yeah, this doesn't really make any sense. I'm going to not do this anymore. I mean, there's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of development underway, and development begets more development. And so the growth in Phoenix, I don't think, is going to taper off anytime soon. Maybe eventually, but what does eventually mean, and what kind of time horizon are we talking about? The picture on the right is, you know, the Village's Florida's friendliest hometown. They look so happy, you know? I mean, when I talk to my mom in Phoenix, you know, the thought of moving back to Chicago, where we're from, is the farthest thing from her mind. Even though during August she doesn't leave her house because she, you know, once people have sort of settled into certain patterns, it takes time, and it may take something really, you know, kind of even more dire than what we've seen before people begin to make different choices. Two of the things I think that might, you know, kind of begin to change the equation. First of all, on the right is in Florida, it's happening in California as well, that the large commercial home insurers are less willing to make insurance policies, especially in hurricane and wildfire-prone areas. So if your largest investment is your home and you cannot insure it, eventually that is going to take a toll on the real estate market, and we may see people beginning to kind of think about, you know, kind of their choices in a little bit different way. On the left, this is a study that was done a few years ago that looked at what would happen if there was a power outage and a heat wave together that went on for multiple days. And they looked at several cities. They looked at Phoenix, Detroit, Atlanta. I think the fourth one was Philadelphia. The worst outcomes were in Phoenix, not surprisingly, because, you know, without air conditioning and power in Phoenix in the summer months with the heat wave, you know, kind of the public health outcomes are really devastating. But that said, people didn't do so well in this model in Detroit either. We're not prepared anywhere in this country to really experience that kind of combination of a power outage and a heat wave. But if something truly large scale and tragic happened, it may begin to kind of change the national discourse about, you know, kind of how we think about land use across the country. Or it may not. As I mentioned, I'm from Chicago. In 1995, there was a devastating heat wave that killed many, many people. And people learned from it, but it didn't necessarily change the choices people make about where and how to live. So this is Buffalo. where much like Duluth, the mayor of Buffalo, kind of several years ago, kind of claimed Buffalo as a climate haven. And I love Buffalo. Buffalo reminds me of Cleveland, a little different, but the reality is, kind of maybe someday people will move to Buffalo for the weather, but this sort of thing still happens. In 2022, the blizzard in Buffalo killed an astonishing number of people in a really horrifying way. And in part, kind of the growth in Buffalo over the past several years has been due to another climate emergency. There are a lot of people who, after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, kind of devastated communities. Buffalo saw a lot of in-migration from Puerto Rico, largely because of family ties. It wasn't that people in Puerto Rico necessarily said, well, this situation is difficult, maybe it'll be better in Buffalo, but because they had employment opportunities and family connections. Buffalo actually saw in the 2020 census the first uptick in population in decades, largely because of the movement here. But if you're moving from one devastating situation and find yourself in another, it's really hard to make an argument that, kind of this is a good idea, right? Because neither place was really prepared for what, kind of what happened. And so thinking about what pushes people to leave the places that they're in, and also what pulls people toward other places, and finding ways to align those things so that we're able to, kind of prepare for and protect people to the greatest extent possible. So this is also from the University of Pennsylvania, from the Green New Deal study. And basically, it shows where people went after Hurricane Katrina. And you see, there's no arrow to Cleveland, right? I mean, when we think about, they'll all be back. I mean, obviously, Hurricane Katrina was devastating. The biggest arrow, the biggest movement wasn't from New Orleans to across the country or to the Great Lakes. It was from New Orleans to Houston, which a few years later, kind of people were faced with, kind of an additional double whammy of more hurricanes. People tend to move close to where they are because of family ties, because of employment opportunities, because of social and cultural connections. And so to expect somebody who's just experienced something, kind of traumatic to kind of totally pick up and change their lives, it doesn't seem to really happen that way. Maybe the first thing that might begin to move and is already in somewhat playing out in parts of the Great Lakes is that water-intensive industries that really need, kind of water are finding it harder and harder to operate in drought situations. There's a reason that so many breweries in Milwaukee and Cleveland and Chicago, or were, kind of 100 years ago. I mean, water-intensive industries really, kind of thrive in a situation where there's ample, affordable, fresh water. So some of these water-intensive industries may, kind of begin to, kind of reinvest in the Great Lakes region. And where employment and where businesses move, people tend to follow. However, the Great Lakes Compact is what protects the Great Lakes Basin. Basically, it says that the water we're taking out of the Great Lakes right now is the amount of water we can take out. And so ultimately, the fate of the Great Lakes Compact is it's a political thing rather than a hard and fast piece of legislation. So, kind of either businesses will move back to the Great Lakes to be able to take advantage of the water, or the water will move to where the, kind of economic activity is. And we shouldn't fool ourselves that the Great Lakes Compact truly protects the Great Lakes, because there have already been quite a lot of incursions, into it, and it's possible that it may not hold, depending on kind of what the coming decades have in store for us. This is Ian McHarg, my favorite landscape architect. He, was one of the kind of first landscape architects to really think about development patterns and land use. And basically, his whole idea is this. that the land tells us what should happen there. You know, there are certain parts of our region and certain parts of the country where buildings and development make more sense. And there are areas where, you know, kind of protecting soil, tree canopy, and especially buried waterways and hydrology in the Great Lakes is important. So essentially what Ian McHarg and his firm would do when they were working on a large development project is really very closely survey a site and say, yep, in these places, the buildings, you know, this is where you should concentrate the development. But make sure you protect these other areas, these wetland areas, these, you know, kind of low spots in the watershed so that, you know, kind of ultimately the development is providing the most human benefit at the least ecological cost. This idea is so simple, it makes a lot of sense, but it isn't reflected in a lot of the ways that, you know, kind of we do and we see communities being developed today. This is some work we've been doing in Cleveland. Cleveland has over 30,000 vacant lots due to population loss. And so can we look at, especially half of those vacant lots are in a land bank, so they're publicly held. Can we look at making smarter decisions about where to build and where not to? Which vacant lots are the ones that are most suitable for new residential development, for new commercial development, and which ones really should be protected to restore the city's tree canopy, to create wildlife habitat and park space and food production and all of the green uses. It's an objective choice. If you understand kind of what's happening under your feet, there are ways to make better decisions about where the building should go and where, more importantly, where they shouldn't. This is just a quick diagram, but in Cleveland, as in most Great Lakes cities, most of the water is actually underground. Great Lakes cities always have this kind of complex and beautiful hydrology as all the streams and creeks feed into the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland and into Lake Erie. But you can't see that hydrology because when the city was rapidly growing, all of those waterways, for the most part, except for, of course, the Cuyahoga and parts of Doan Brook and Rocky River, but almost all of the water in the city is underground in big pipes. Essentially, it's a storm sewer. And so what we can say maybe is that, you know, kind of as land in the land banks begin to kind of form, you know, we can make some choices about vacant land that sits on top of buried water. It was never smart to build on top of water for all the reasons that you know. A building on top of water is just asking for trouble, and it also endangers the health of the Great Lakes. So as we are seeing more and more vacant land in our cities and regions, you know, we can kind of make some choices to say, all right, we're not going to put a building back here. We're going to keep some of these strands for green space as a way of improving quality of life for people who live in these places and also rebuilding urban ecosystems. Again, simple diagram, simple idea, really hard to implement. But the idea over time is that, you know, you can add green back into cities that restore natural systems while still allowing places for infill development to occur. So who are the folks who may be coming as refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants? Answer is we don't really know, but we do know, looking last summer, when you see a surge of people moving into a city, that it really takes a toll on city services. New York City experienced the most, you know, kind of largest influx of migrants last summer of any city in the country. Denver had the highest number of migrants per capita. And both of these cities are famously progressive, but you could see the systems just cracking at the seams because the number of people and the extreme amount of need that people arrived with. This isn't, you know, obviously national climate migration. This is international, people kind of coming to the US and landing in these two cities. All this slide is meant to show is that if you have a surge of new residents, especially people, you know, kind of coming in a refugee situation, that there are no cities that are capable of really handling that at scale. It pushes systems and creates all kinds of political challenges as well. So thinking about if we are going to see massive migration, you know, nationally and internationally, how we can be better prepared for it is going to be key. And again, as I mentioned before, the displacement risks are real and potentially extreme. As people continue to flood into Miami, you know, they're choosing the safest places in that city, the high ground, literally the high ground, where kind of housing prices are skyrocketing, and people who have lived in communities for generations are no longer able to afford to stay in their homes, and they get pushed into places that are more vulnerable to flooding and hurricanes and other risks. So that dynamic is also at play because kind of money in a capitalist environment is always going to kind of push things in ways that are both predictable, but also sometimes really surprising. So there are all kinds of questions. Will population grow or decline? Will it be gradual or a sudden influx of new residents? Will people be coming with lower incomes or higher incomes? Are we looking at younger families or aging populations? Would migration cause increased diversity or less diversity? Is it, kind of primarily people, kind of within the US moving with similar culture and language, or is it really, kind of expanding the range of people that we're seeing in cities? None of these things that we have answers to, but understanding, kind of that these factors are all at play can help us think about how to prepare. So what can we do to prepare? Well, one of the first things we can do, because at least in my line of work, one of the first things that happens in a lot of community meetings and public events is we talk about, kind of indigenous land rights, and we acknowledge the, kind of people who lived in these places before we did. None of those land acknowledgements really mean anything unless we're prepared to really think about, kind of how to, kind of re-envision land and water rights in the Great Lakes region. And I would suggest that if we are on the verge of population migration into the Great Lakes, that this is an ideal time to think about, kind of who the land and water truly belongs to, and how, kind of the movement of people and resources in our country and in our region can occur in a way that's more fair and more equitable than anything we've seen in our region before. So in terms of what we can do to prepare, forgive me for this extremely boring slide, but these are all the things that we could be doing, and in fact, we should already be doing, and are a lot of things that are already underway. Climate action plans, climate equity policies, home weatherization, energy efficiency in our buildings, blue-green infrastructure, renewable clean energy, investments in public transportation, climate resilient infrastructure, emergency preparedness, education, awareness, collaboration. All these things, which none of them are a silver bullet, but they're all things that we should be doing anyway. And my colleagues who I've been working with on climate migration issues call this the get your house in order strategy. If you're gonna throw a party, there are things you need to do. You need to clean your house and get your house in order. And even if nobody shows up for your party, at least your house is clean, right? I mean, it's like, this is about as bread and butter as it gets. But the work that we're doing is really to try to convince people that there's more urgency to it. If we think that, kind of, oh, Cleveland, we're a climate haven. Duluth, we're a climate haven. People might be less likely to move quickly to do all of the things and other things on this list because we feel like we're safe from the worst that may happen. But what we're trying to suggest through this work is that, kind of stepping up our efforts to do all of these things will make cities, our cities, better for the people who are already living there and better prepared to, kind of receive climate migrants if and when that begins to happen, and if it happens at scale. So I'm going to end there, only to say that we publish all of our work. It's easy to find through our website. This is not just an ad, but this November, we're publishing a new book on this kind of question of Great Lakes climate migration that includes some of the work we've been doing, but also has contributors from around the country who are also wrestling with these kinds of questions. So if this is a topic you're interested in, come and see us in November. We're going to do a book release event, or send me an email. Happy to send you the book when it's released. It's the next issue of our journal, Urban Infill. So I'm going to stop there, see if you all have comments or questions or anything you want to talk about. Thank you. Yes. Oh.
Thank you for your presentation. At the beginning, you talked about various factors that will move people around and stuff, but you never mentioned like tax incentives or tax policy or anything from the federal government. Is that because you don't believe that that's even possible to do with our ineffective government, or because maybe the American feeling of freedom and choice is too strong, and so it wouldn't be possible to kind of have an outside, that be one of the factors to move people around?
It's a really interesting point. I read an article recently that said the U.S. has all of these potential climate havens and no one's moving there. What should we do? And their recommendation was actually tax policy to try to incentivize people to move. I don't know if it would work or not. I mean, you certainly wouldn't get my mom to Cleveland with, but the idea though, when we think about like the Great Migration, which was probably the last time in this country that we saw a massive movement of people from the south to the north, it wasn't at all at the federal level a tax incentive. It was more driven by private industry looking for workers, and of course social issues of people, kind of needing to be in a place where they felt safer than where they were during the Jim Crow era in the South. Yeah.
Well, another factor is the insurance companies refusing to insure, property along waterfronts, et cetera.
Yeah. And it's happening, right? I mean, Allstate and State Farm have already almost completely pulled out of California. In Florida, there is a state-funded insurance program to help people who wouldn't be able to get private insurance for their houses. How long that system can hold, it depends on how many hurricanes and how many wildfires take place, right? So, I mean, those financial incentives may come. I guess the reason I didn't talk about it is because I don't understand enough about it, I mean, and I also it would take some federal policy making that, as you kind of suggested in your question, that maybe we're not prepared to do. States' rights really mean a lot here, and again, declaring sort of winners and losers could really backfire.
Yeah, if you're going to move people, if you're moving people, you need to move the jobs too.
Yeah.
So people are not going to move until their local living conditions become impossible. I mean, I'm not worried about moving out of my Florida home. I don't think the water's going to get high enough while I'm still around. So I'm not moving my winter home north.
What the data from FEMA, and FEMA doesn't really track very specifically where people go post disaster, but the data that they do have show that after an emergency, the majority of people who've been displaced move within about 15 miles. Because, I mean, think about it, it's your home. It's your largest investment. If there's a way to kind of come back and reclaim what you've lost, people are tending to do that. But the interesting thing in the FEMA data is that even for people who've only moved 15 minutes or 15 miles away from their original home, in a lot of cases, the new location is safer because they may be moving from a low spot in the watershed to a higher spot. So they're still, kind of in Florida or wherever they are, but they're, kind of making a, kind of a intentional decision to get a little bit safer than where they were.
I've got a question over here. You had talked about the water-intensive industries, and agriculture was the first one. That's been my entire career, has worked in agriculture. As you do urban planning, and I know there's a lot of talk about local food, local production, and I know you can't grow it all in the cities, but is there any concept of coordinating in some of these green spaces or brown spaces, agricultural development within some of these areas that are vacant, say within cities that are declining?
So coming from a background in agriculture, I'm sure you recognize kind of the challenges of scale. What we've seen in Cleveland and Detroit and Buffalo and other cities, Youngstown, is a growing interest in local food production. In Cleveland, I'll say that the majority of food production is happening primarily for education, in that people like learn what they can grow and can grow some food for their families, but it isn't a large enough output to really meet the need, the hunger, the need for calories that that we see. And also, cities have infrastructure and soil conditions that are reflective of urbanism, right? So in some ways, I mean, I've done a lot of urban agriculture projects, and sometimes I wake up and I'm like, what are we doing? I mean, we're building new houses out at the periphery of our region where the topsoil is 5 feet deep. Taller than me in some places, where in the city, where topsoil may be like 1/2 inch or 1 inch, probably has some, kind of residual contamination to it. And also, kind of places where density is actually beneficial because that's how you support public transit and things like that. It's not that I'm opposed to urban agriculture. I think having food being produced and processed close to where the people consume it is really important in terms of reducing, kind of energy consumption. It's just hard to operationalize at scale. We've seen some bigger projects. There's a giant greenhouse in the city of Cleveland that produces a whole lot of lettuce. There's a lot of interest in vertical farming, especially now that you can get, kind of photovoltaics and such that use less energy. Cleveland used to be a greenhouse center for the country. And in the 70s, when energy got so high, all of those businesses kind of disappeared. So maybe over time, we'll start to see more of that. But what we see right now is a little bit kind of piecemeal, some really interesting pilot projects, but I haven't seen many projects that really scale up in a way that can meet the need of what people need to eat.
It's a second question related to that too. As you work with your planners, maybe agricultural planners, because I know in the agriculture area, I've worked across the Midwest, we've got solar companies now that are wanting to come into prime agricultural land and put solar fields up to take up usable cropland, and it seems like cities could be the opportunity to develop that on top of buildings or, flat stored buildings. Is there those types of discussions going on in planning between, agricultural and urban developments?
It's definitely happening. I don't want to kind of get into the politics of it, but the large federal funding for clean energy and pollution reduction seems to be having a real impact. I mean, to the extent that, like in our region, Cleveland is sort of that blue center in a pretty conservative, like larger region. But there's a recent grant, many millions of dollars in Northeast Ohio that's going to fund solar energy in the city of Cleveland, but also an industrial scale solar installation on a former industrial site out in Painesville, which is, kind of at the kind of edge of our little 5-county region. So I think it's a place, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I think we're a place we can come together politically. Because in Painesville, they're like, whatever the politics of it, we know that our coal plant is going away. And if the federal government is willing to step up and help us transition to a solar plant, we're going to take that money, and they are. So, I mean, those two things are happening in tandem. So across the city of Cleveland, people will have access to solar power and microgrids, and at the, kind of township and outer county area, these kind of larger scale industrial solar facilities are being constructed. It's a pilot project. In a year or two, we may have a better sense of, kind of how successful it is. But if we really are moving toward a clean energy transition, layer the food kind of growing on top of that, and suddenly we may start to see some things that really, again, to that last slide, make things better for the people who are already in the region, but also prepare us, kind of to accommodate lots more people and industries in the, kind of foreseeable future.
Good talk. You of course didn't get really to the who are the migrants going to be, and that's the huge question. Are there going to be people living somewhere else within the borders, so the culture's similar, or are they going to be primarily people from Central America that can no longer live where they are because of climate? It will require completely different solutions, I think, just because of the cultural differences and employment opportunities.
If I had to guess, I would say both and, right? I mean, yeah, you know, and so we've done it before. You know, I think about like all the different ethnicities and cultures that make up the city of Cleveland even today. And yeah, it's changing. It's not the world it was in the, you know, kind of 19th century. But it feels like this is an opportunity where if we get it right, it can be transformative in a way that, you know, kind of adds a lot culturally, economically, and ecologically to our region. I tend to be overly optimistic because otherwise my work's just too depressing.
The Great Migration, we didn't do a real good job.
We didn't. And we could make those same mistakes all over again.
And we could replicate, yeah.
Hi, thanks for your very informative talk. Two things, one relating to the agriculture and solar. There's a project that one of Bill Gates' company is building outside of Columbus, 6,000-acre solar farm, where they're attempting to insert agricultural growth somewhere in there. We'll see how successful that might be. That's a huge, huge operation. Secondly, the water table in the Great Lakes area. Do you have any sense of how that's staying? Is it stable? Is it going down? Because things like Intel, which is building there around Columbus, is going to take 1 million gallons of water a day out of our Central Ohio area, and that's a lot of water.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to that. I don't have the expertise to answer it accurately, but I share those concerns, both about the growing water needs of industry and also, you know, kind of hydrofracking and how much water that uses as well. And particularly in our region where economic growth has been hard to come by, there's a lot of political, you know, kind of desire to see reinvestment in our region, and I think we just have to be really careful not to kind of give away the water that sustains us for an economic return. It needs to be both, you know.
Yeah, on the solar, I think they're looking at elevating the solar panels so you can have crops or animals underneath them. Solar panel takes a little over 20% of the energy from the sun. The rest goes through it like a window. You should be able to, maybe the shade would even be beneficial. Most of these big water consumers, like electric power or Intel, are using the water as a cooling medium and returning the majority of the water to the watershed. So the actual consumption is low, but the use is high.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of growing things under solar panels, I mean, we could corner the market maybe on shiitake mushrooms or something in the shade of the solar panel. I mean, I also think about that might be a place where urban areas have a little bit of an advantage and a disadvantage, which is, you know, kind of just the extreme number of brownfield sites that we have in cities, you know, that really make it difficult to grow food and also for other kinds of development, but, you know, kind of that whole movement of brownfields to bright fields could potentially have a lot of impact, you know, kind of on the region. I have a friend who works for the EPA who told me he's never put a shovel or a probe in the ground in Cleveland and had it come up clean. I think he's exaggerating, but we do have a lot of legacy contamination, and so being able to transition to, you know, kind of clean energy could potentially be really beneficial.
Okay, so I have a question, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, and I don't want to make it like too political or anything, but in light of our presidential debate coming up, do you know if either party is doing anything to, I guess, help with this climate migration issue?
Migration in any form is such a political hot button right now. In terms of climate preparedness, in terms of climate resilience, I think that, kind of the Biden-Harris administration has put a tremendous, more than I've ever seen in my lifetime, amount of resources toward a clean energy transition. I think the reality, though, is that whoever becomes president is going to have to tackle these questions. And the things that you say in a political rally might be different than the things that you actually have to do in real life. As crises continue to sort of pile up, eventually, kind of our country is going to, really be strained by the amount of resources it takes to address the problems that we've made. So regardless of your political background or preferences, we really are in this together, and we're going to have to figure it out. There may be different political opinions about the best ways to invest in changes. But anyway, the short answer to your question is that I think there's no question that the Biden-Harris administration has done more toward this kind of question of a clean energy transition than any federal administration before them. And it seems as if, kind of that work is likely to continue, kind of depending on the outcome of the election. But something's going to continue no matter what, because there's just too much urgency to the issue. And there's a lot of money in places that are extraordinarily vulnerable. I mean, if you're a developer in Miami, God bless you, but people with, kind of money and political power are in places where they are at extreme risk. And those risks are only going to get worse. And so, I would think that if not in my lifetime, perhaps in yours, we're going to start to see much more, kind of crossing of the aisles and different, kind of people who used to believe kind of one thing, maybe thinking about it a little different way. We're going to have to, because the only alternative is really too devastating to contemplate.
I have a question about the Great Lakes Water Compact. Does it have a date or a renewal that's coming up? And I thought we were in it with Canada as well.
We are. I'm sorry. My map is only the U.S. Yep. The northern part of the Great Lakes also matters. Yeah, it's an agreement where all the communities, all of the jurisdictions around the Great Lakes agreed to a certain set of standards. I don't know if there's an upcoming renewal date. It would be really good to see the Great Lakes Compact strengthened and, kind of made more enforceable. Because there's a lot of ways around it, and kind of little incursions into the Great Lakes region, I think the Great Lakes can handle, but big kind of incursions. The pipeline that a landscape architect friend of mine thinks needs to head to New Mexico would be such a terrible idea. But kind of people who have invested in other parts of the region are really eyeing, though, not just the amount of water that we have, but the growing problems that we have of too much water. Because that's what flooding is, right? We can't manage the water that we're experiencing. And in the meantime, there are other thirsty parts of the country being like, hey, we could use some of that. The Great Lakes Compact probably needs to be updated and strengthened. What's there now is enough to kind of hold on for the time being, but I think that, in the years to come, it's going to be increasingly under pressure, to kind of make some changes that allow for water to move out of the region. If you think about it too, like, what's heavier than water, right? And if you had to like pump water from the middle of the country all the way out to the coasts, the amount of energy that would take is just, how are we going to get to, kind of a reduced carbon emission future if we're expending such tremendous amounts of energy to move water? In my take on it, moving people to the water makes vastly more sense than moving water to, kind of the people, but that's not always the way we make decisions politically in this country.
And I look at, like, I have relatives who currently live in Colorado. There are huge water fights over there just among the states.
Yeah.
I mean, how much clout does Canada hold? Or would Canada say, yeah, let's ship all of the water from the Great Lakes to Phoenix or New Mexico? Wouldn't there be huge issues that Canada would object to, and we could use that as part of the reasoning?
Yeah, I don't know enough about the politics of it. The hydrology of it, I kind of have a baseline understanding of, but the decision making and how these things how these decisions get made, I don't fully understand. But I hope that what you say is true, that there's too much sort of vested interest in the Great Lakes to allow for the devastation of the Great Lakes Basin, because it would be a devastation.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, and I might be naive. Is there like a model city or a model plan that some of this is, are you reading about it or something? Because, or is it sort of, I hate to use this word, hodgepodge, but is somebody in Ohio talking to somebody in New Mexico, or is Denver talking to somebody in Cleveland, so that some of these ideas go across states, or are you just, I don't mean you, but people here are just talking privately and people over here are talking privately, and then nothing gets done until it's an emergency?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of networked national organizations where the sustainability directors of major cities come together. There are international conversations that are happening. So there's definitely, it feels like some learning transfer, knowledge transfer happening between different parts of the region. But as far as a coordinated effort, kind of the thing that it would take to really have an organized, logical, sane, kind of climate migration policy, I haven't seen it yet. It may come eventually. There's a lot of knowledge that's emerging and a lot of pilot projects. Sometimes all it takes, though, is a pilot project to actually be successful, and then you start to see multiple municipalities taking it on. San Diego and the county around it has done a really smart sort of carbon reduction plan that also is very heavily hydrological. It's a model that we use in Cleveland, and San Diego, Cleveland, not very similar places, but there are a lot of similar principles that kind of influence one versus the other. But there's, as far as I can see, sort of no federal policy making other than kind of through the EPA and other organizations, the National Forest Service, where they're putting their money. I mean, if suddenly you're starting to see these things, I mean, they come across my inbox all the time, $20 million grant opportunity, and these are the criteria that you need in order to secure those funds for your region. Well, then suddenly everybody's playing with the same playbook in order to, kind of secure those resources, kind of pursuing the same goals. But, kind of, we'll see. EPA right now has a program called the Community Change Grants. Those are their $20 million grants. And the call for proposals was 85 pages long. I read the whole thing. And it really kind of lays out a vision for how you can make choices in ways that encourage a reduction in pollution and an improvement in climate resilience. So maybe that's the way that we'll get to some sort of cohesive strategy, is if the dollars and the policies start to align. We'll see, though. I say we'll see all the time because so much of this is uncertain. It's why we use scenario planning, is because we don't really know kind of there are too many factors at play. We don't know what's going to happen. And so if you plan for a variety of different scenarios, you don't really know which one's going to happen. But if you kind of think through a strategy, like if we start to see population growing and, kind of extreme climate, kind of this is our playbook for as that unfolds. Then you have to get really good at watching the indicators to make sure that, you really understand which situation is unfolding around you, so you're grabbing the right, kind of policies to align with what's actually taking place around you. It's hard to see, kind of the future unfolding around you. It's easy, 20 years from now, we can look back and be like, in 2024, we really should have done these 3 things because we would be in a better place right now. None of us are really good at predicting the future. We sometimes think we are, but nobody can really do it properly. So it's better, I think, to stay kind of light on your feet, to kind of envision that different things may unfold. And if different situations happen, these are maybe how we could begin to respond.
Thank you very much, Terry.
Thank
you.